Creative Folkestone Triennial, and 2021 called The Plot. And I think it's the first time I've ever attempted to address any number of people sitting on a bar stool. Well, normally I address one other person sitting on a bar stool at least, but it's actually quite comfortable. Many of you, perhaps all of you, already know Christopher Houghton Budd because he is a local. Not only local, but very visible, because he is most of the time accessible in the urban room on the plaza. I just wanted to give a little background as to how I came across Christopher. I started coming to Folkestone regularly in 2012, and he came to live here in 2013. And I think we met the first time because Christopher wrote to Alistair Upton, the director of Creative Folkestone, and Alistair said, "What do I do with a letter like this?" Something like that. And I loved the letter, and so Christopher and I met up and began to take tea together. What I like about Christopher's view of the world is that it is holistic. So most people in academic positions and most people who practice opinions on any particular subject tend to be modernist in the sense that they know one area of knowledge in some great depth, or they think they do. Modernism was incredibly bad at joining up the silos of knowledge into something which might approach a philosophy or a view of the world which could actually be helpful. Christopher has always been a holistic philosopher, from what I know of his background, and that makes him close to being an artist, whether or not he paints, draws, makes diagrams, or puts things on pieces of paper or blackboards. Christopher started talking to me about his plaza and about the new design of the High Street, probably in 2016, if not before, while I was working on the 2017 Triennial, which you may remember was called Double Edge. And so, of course, I was immediately attracted to the fact that the plaza was at the axis of the meeting point of the two axes of the Double Edge exhibition. There were two axes, one being the Pent Valley, the other being the seafront. Those were the two edges around which Folkestone is arranged. And the plaza is at the point where those two edges intersect. And so it was very obvious for me to ask Christopher to express and articulate what the plaza meant to him and to Folkestone, which he did, but by the time we had his proposal and accepted it for the triennial, there was no money left. It was too late for that piece to be in the 2017 triennial. But I enjoyed the proposal so much that as soon as I started work on this triennial, I asked Christopher to continue to develop it. And that has continued into the artwork which you now see, called Forgiving Light. And instead of interpreting that through the two edges of Folkestone that were the subject of the 2017 Triennial, we now interpret that through the St. Eanswyth's Way, the St. Eanswyth's plot within the plot exhibition, because the plaza is where St. Eanswyth's water entered the Pent and the sea, so it represents the last stop of St. Eanswyth's water. I'm very happy that Christopher is a member of the artistic community in Folkestone. I think he has a huge amount to bring to it. I look forward very much to hearing what he has to say tonight and discussing it with you at the end. I should just say that this is one of three talks arranged, conceptualized and arranged by Christopher on the subject of circulation. And that is completely in tune with the plot exhibition, which is all about circulation. Most obviously a circulation of the blood through the William Harvey analogy, but also the circulation of goods and people through the post-industrial way, which we call the Milky Way, and the circulation of water through St. Eansworth's way. So, as I say, I look forward to hearing your questions at the end of what Christopher has to say. But now I'd like you to help me welcome Christopher to the blackboard.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Lewis. I thought I should just contextualize a bit what this is about. As Lewis said, I came up with the idea of 3 talks on circulation because, not because it's part of the triennial, that's fortuitous, because I've been looking at this topic for quite a few years. And as if you were looked at last week's presentation, we looked at William Harvey's idea about circulation of blood. So this is a very old story for Folkestone, and I think it's a very important story. It was historically, but I thought it's important to revisit what the circulation of blood means in a larger picture. So I asked, originally I asked Dr. Fuss from New York to talk about that last week. I asked Andy Haldane from the Bank of England to give the talk I'm going to give tonight, but he scuttled off to the RSA a week ago, I think. So you've got me. And next week, we have a talk about traffic and people from Steve Smith, which is about, it's kind of generic, but it's a little bit, when are we going to sort out the traffic circulation in this town? So it's not all built around a non-existent ferry, but perhaps around people. So that's a bit the context. And then just to, it's going to be a performance lecture. At least I'm told it's a performance lecture. We'll see how that works. And then what I plan to do is speak for maybe a large half an hour. And then we'll collect questions. So I don't want to do a one-on-one Q&A. Collect questions and then have some kind of informed conversation. That way I know who's thinking what in the room, where you're at. And we can kind of knit it all together. I'm going to kind of, I've written down here, I'm going to pitch it high and low. What I mean is, in the background of what I'm going to say is my professional knowledge about finance and economics. I'm an economic and monetary historian. And because this will go on YouTube, I need to be accurate in what I say. So that will be in the background. But for me, it's so important in an evening like this to speak to, I don't know who. I'm not going to say the person in the street, but I don't know who you are. I can hardly see you. I don't know your profession, your background in finance. So I really like these audiences because you have no control over what's going on. So in that sense, I hope to speak on various levels at the same time, but successfully. So this is a performance lecture. This is a technique that I've used for about 30 years. It's black paper, obviously. And if you go to schools nowadays, well, if you went to schools a few years ago, you get a green board. That's a horrible medium to work on. Now you have whiteboards, but they're not whiteboards. They're electronic, so you can't play with them. And in a way, color on white never works. So some time ago, I started using black paper, and I have 600 rolls about this size in my archive. This is 601, probably. And it's deliberate as a kind of medium. When I'm in universities, I call it PowerPoint Plus, for those who think I'm a dinosaur and don't know how PowerPoint works. And if you know how PowerPoint works, the best PowerPoint is the one that doesn't look like PowerPoint. It looks like someone's drawing on a blackboard. So this is PowerPoint Plus. This down here are my color tests, so don't ignore that. I mean, do ignore that. So that's the kind of procedure. And now I want to start with a very fundamental thought. And it was Goethe who once said, the eye, this eye, is created by the light for the light. And if you think about that thought, the eye, this organ, the eye, is created by the light for the light. It doesn't exist for itself, is the point. And last week, when we talked about circulation of the blood and the heart, the main message that came through, as I understood it, was the heart is created by the blood for the blood. So if you study circulation of blood, the blood circulates before the heart ever appears, and you can see that in embryology. And so the heart kind of comes about in order to accommodate the circulating and already beating blood. So again, it's the same image. The heart, this important organ, is not there for its own sake. It's expressing something you can't actually see or making visible something which is in the background. And it's the thing in the background which is important. And if I kind of think up a thought about what's behind that, I was very pleased with myself this morning. I'm not so pleased with it now, but I'm committed to it. What I do is created by myself out of myself. And that's my starting point. What anyone does is actually created by themselves out of themselves. And that, in my way of understanding the plot theme, or part of the plot theme, we're then dealing with our perceived or conceived reality and life as we know it or as we experience it. So often we're caught between our understanding of life and what we experience. Our understanding often doesn't explain what we're experiencing. And certainly for in economics, hardly anything you're taught in economics bears any relationship to reality. I say that candidly. We have the great power in economics to make reality fit our theories. But that gets us off a hook, because then you don't know whether your theory has any reality or not. Because you can go from a theoretical statement, it becomes a trope, that becomes policy, and you organize life to fit your policy. And then you never know whether the idea was real or not anymore. This is a huge power economics has. And so for me, I think it's important to be totally aware what is reality as I experience it, and what is reality as I assume it to be, or think it is, or someone tells me it is. And I want to try and play with this triennial, or at least honor this triennial theme, as far as I understand it. But my focus is going to be on the financial system, and playing with my little idea, I want to make the statement that the financial system has been created by humanity for humanity. And I'm saying that very deliberately, because for most people, the financial system is, they don't quite know what. It's the cause of everything. It's the thing to blame. Some people know it technically, but quite where it came from, quite where it's going, that's not so clear. And my argument, the thesis I want to test on you tonight, is the financial system, which I'm going to describe, is created by humanity for humanity. So what do I mean by the financial system? This is a bit technical, but I'm going to try and keep it not simple but clear. It has two components. If I start from the financial end, that's money and capital. And money and capital, they are both reflections of some reality or even proxies for it. So money, in my argument, is really linked to the goods in the economy, the things we need in order to have a material existence. So the chairs you're sitting on, the food you're eating, all this is goods, and it all has to be made available, produced and distributed, and available in shops and so on. And this is reflected in money, because money for an economist is a means of exchange. Without money, you cannot get the food you need to eat in today's world. In a barter world, you didn't have money, you just swapped things, we think. I'm not sure that ever really existed. But in a modern monetized economy, everything is facilitated through money. And so an economist would call that a medium of exchange. On the other side of the economy, everything that's produced, invented, everything we do, in fact, all the goods we produce, in the background, someone had the idea and he had the skill and the capacities to make this good possible. So if you take a tree growing in the ground, that is not yet a chair, and it will not become a chair out of its own nature. Someone will have the idea chair, someone will need a chair to sit on, and someone has to turn this tree into a chair. It's a kind of invisible act, but there's no tree that I know of that turns itself into chairs. Nothing that we sit on or that we eat or anything is there except some human being somewhere had an idea and took hold of the raw materials and turned them in, made their idea visible. And what we don't see in a modern economy is the capacities that are needed to do this, the training you might take, the education you have. All this has to be funded. And in my argument, the main purpose of capital is to fund, as to underwrite people's capacities, either the development of their capacities, like in school or in university, or when they go into business, to capitalize their new business. This is, for me, the real purpose of capital. It may also earn you money, but that isn't the point of capital. Capital cannot earn you money unless it's put to use by someone who's trying to develop something. So the financial system, in that sense, has these two very clear, distinct components. And then what do I mean by the financial system is created by humanity for humanity? I thought I would do that with this brief historical survey. And I've half done it, and you can't see my little crib notes on here, but I can, luckily, because all the weight of my argument is going to go on this drawing. And normally I wouldn't be so fussy, but because it's being filmed, I have to be fairly accurate. And you'll see in this presentation that, as I say, I'm an economic and monetary historian. I think I know my stuff, and I think this is a true depiction, or will be, of the human story. You will notice it's coming down and going up. It has two parts. There's a central part here. I've done this quite deliberately. And it's a kind of journey from an ancient past until 1694, which is the foundation of the Bank of England, and then what's happened since. And why I draw it like this, the clue is from, I think, from Jung, who had this idea that humanity is individuating itself. So it's coming from the gods, or wherever we came from, the elders, ancient communities, or however we describe that. And then we become more and more democratic. Now we're here, and now we're in charge of our own universe. And now we go forward from this point onwards. This point is when the King of England was finally lost his power over the money in favor of the citizens as represented by the owners of the Bank of England. That's a topic you might want to debate. But this is, for me, the crucial turning point here. Also in financial history, because the founding of the Bank of England is pretty much a fulcrum for all modern finance. I don't say that because I'm English. I just think it's technically the case. So this is a kind of turning point here. And it's this coming down and going up is my positive story. So coming down, yes, but the future is uplifting. And I do it quite deliberately. And all that is conveyed in the shape. And now this idea of individuation from Jung, and you probably find lots of other people say it, you can compare a human being at this point to a human being at this point. Here we had gods, we had elders. You didn't do anything that the elders didn't give you permission to do. Boys did what their fathers had done. This isn't modern language, but you just followed in your father's footsteps. Your path in life was mapped out, what you're going to do was mapped out, and you disobeyed the community and the elders at your peril. It was not on to step outside the tribe and be an individual. And that's why when you go back, you will not find modern democracy, you will not find a sense of self, you will not find any instruments or any philosophies which we take for granted today as modern individuals who can just disobey their governments, do what they want, and so on. And it's important to make some kind of image. The kind of state of mind we have, or the conditions we have, the kind of constitutions we have today simply did not exist before, and they came about because we are more and more taking charge of our lives. I think that's a historical fact. We do have little issues, like our understanding of democracy may not be the same in every culture and every country of the world, but we put huge credence on how we understand modern constitutional history, democracy, and so on. And this also, the Bank of England, is quite critical, in my view, to link it to the constitutional monarchy, of which I am an advocate, not of the royal family, but of a constitutional monarchy. And in fact, when I completed my doctorate on finance and I was at the Viva, there were really very few questions. But then one examiner said, I'd like to ask a question. And his question was, if we accept your recommendations for the Bank of England, will the monarchy survive? And I said to the chair, this is not in my doctorate. You have to give me permission to answer. And I will answer, but only if it doesn't affect the outcome of this examination. She said, OK. So I said, the whole point of my recommendations is that the constitutional monarchy will continue. So I'm throwing that out as a clear belief on my part, but it's part of this story, certainly from a worldwide point of view. Now, I can populate this downward trajectory, if you like, with just kind of recorded highlights. All of it I could substantiate, but I just want to give you an image. If we go back to this point of gods, and I've got down here India, meaning the India, like ancient India, where you really, you had gods and you just believed in all these things. You had no individuality, really. It's a very long time back. And when you come to Egypt, or thereabouts, you have pharaohs and priests in temples. We may not take this seriously today, but in those days you did take it very seriously. You did not dispute that there was a pharaoh and the pharaoh had huge powers and so on. And when you come to Rome, and I hope you can see what I'm saying, there's a gradual change. You have Caesars. And Caesars were very important in this step because they were thought by the Romans to be half men and half gods. And at this time, you have a great deal of the origin, in fact, of personality of the legal person for a company or for you. Once you're born, you get a birth certificate. The fact you're given a persona, which is simply Latin for a mask. When you're born, you're given a mask. This comes from this time. So you can start to see not the disbelief in gods, but, oh, God, the God and we are men at the same time. And that's what a Caesar was, whether we give that credence or not today. And then you can go further and come to kings in the sense of the kings who rule by divine right. And we also might not take that very seriously today, but this went on for a very long time. And if you look at modern countries like China, like Russia, like a number of countries, their presidents are organizing that they have continual permanent presidency. If you look at China in particular, it's organized that he can stay as president for a very long time. So it's far removed from the idea of 4 years and you're out. He's trying to put himself back in the place of an emperor who never leaves the throne. And so it's not a finished story, ruling by divine right. And if you look in the history of this country in particular, you come down to, for example, if you look at the land, it's the crown and all this, who owns the land, the crown owns the land, all that is linked to this notion that kings rule by divine right. And this was seriously challenged, especially in the time of the first, what I call the first Renaissance, by the merchants. And the merchants were very important because most economics until this point was agrarian, more or less. Of course, there was trade, but the merchants at the time of the 15th, 16th century, they lived by buying and selling things, and for them, the market had to clear. So it doesn't matter how much stuff you bring into the market, it has to clear, and what's going out of the market is a monetized surplus, and that's what merchants look for. They don't want to go home with any unsold carpets and making a sort of image. They're not caught in the finiteness of the goods world. They use that world to create a kind of surplus, and now they're free of this, and they can go with the surplus anywhere. They can go into carpets or into cabbages or into cars. It's an irrelevance what they link their money to. The money is now made free. And this is really important. And a good example is with the Medicis, when they even bought themselves a papacy. That's a really good image of how at this time all that was kind of being overridden by free capital created through merchants. And today, still the driving force of the economic and financial evolution are the merchant banks. So if you go to the City of London, you go to Lombard Street, and Lombardy was where this kind of banking began. If you go to Goldman Sachs, it's a merchant bank. It's still the driving force of all modern finance from that moment onwards. And then you come to this point here, when the citizens, at least it's a nice idea, the citizens take over. And the founding of the Bank of England, I won't give you the whole story, but we had kings, and they kept borrowing money from the people to finance their wars, but then they didn't pay the money back. I'm putting this very simply, so sometimes they just had their heads chopped off. But in the founding of the Bank of England, what the basis was, the king of that time needed 1.2 million pounds to prosecute a war or fund the state, his state. And because of his forebears' bad behavior, the Bank of England said you can have it at 8% forever. And this was the end of the king's power over the financial system. Now it was the start of national debt. It was a very clever move. So you can have your 1.2 million, but not because you're the king, because you're a borrower, and you pay 8% forever on 1.2 million pounds. Nice little deal. And there's a lot hidden inside the story of the Bank of England. So for me, that's the point where now we are here, we're all citizens, and in my professional work in central banking and so on, I like to talk about citizenized central banking, when people like us, the citizens of this country, tell the central bank what to do. It doesn't tell us what to do. This may be why Andy Haldane didn't give this talk, because he was the chief economist of the Bank of England. And it's a bit tricky if you're a chief economist of the central bank to not think that you send the money out and you call it back, to think, in fact, that's an illusion. The money only goes out because it's called out, and it only comes back because it's sent back. So in this image, we're right at the cusp. Do you spend money because the central bank pumps it into the economy, or do you spend money because you need to buy something? Where does this process begin? So when you come to this point, you already, especially nowadays, every citizen is capable of understanding and running this process. So that's what I mean by citizenized central banking. And it means that, in fact, as we go forward in this second part, that will be more and more the feature of modern economic life, that the authorities, the financial authorities, will have less and less levers, less and less credence in them. People will just act anarchically, and we just hope it all works out. When you can create banks out of nothing, and you can do it on your mobile phone, and there's no regulation, Bitcoin and all this stuff. This is a nightmare for a central banker. Who is running this show? Who's going to make sure it's stable and it functions? We have no control over this any longer. And that's the characteristic of this period. So you could say now, you may not experience it, but I think it's the case that we live in a modern economy in a kind of condition of permanent instability. If we don't have a crisis today, we know it's coming. I'm speaking professionally. We might try and cover it over, and we have things like when the Thai baht crashed in 1997, that was okay because we quarantined Thailand, so it couldn't go anywhere else. When in 2000, the Argentine peso became a problem, that was okay because we quarantined Argentina, we thought. But today, you cannot quarantine any country from any other country, except for COVID, obviously. But the idea that you could put a wall around the country is no longer used. We live in a single global economy, and you control nothing through your financial system. In fact, you just hope for the best. And also, I wanted to just indicate this has a kind of story behind it. We're going up into a rarefied atmosphere, because for most people, modern finance is completely invisible. It's rarefied in that sense. And that's true whether you're dealing in currencies you can't see, cash you don't have, whether you do bookkeeping, it's all kind of representative of something which you can't see or touch. And that's a really important phenomenon. It was never the case then. You had gold, silver, weighty coins. But now nothing exists in the physical plane to represent money. Maybe a bank statement if you're old enough to print it out. I'm thinking of a young person in the room. So I print out my bank statement so I can reconcile it, and then I know how much money I've got. My son says, "Why did you do that?" So it's very important, this image, that we're in a totally rarefied world, and no one can see what this finance is on which we've now all dependent. And this finance is also very unstable, perhaps for that reason. Now, in this second part, I just want to mention what these are, so you have a kind of sense of modern history. The dates, I just start with the dates and then the event, and then I'm going to put a story on it. This is the founding of the Bank of England in 1694. The next step is 1815, which is when we defeated Napoleon finally. The next step is 1912, or thereabouts, when there was a second Renaissance, but nobody saw it because the First World War obliterated it. That's a thesis of mine. Then you come to 1923, when the British economist John Maynard Keynes wrote a very important book. What do we do without the gold standard? What do we do when Britain no longer runs the world? It's called A Tract on Monetary Reform, and this is a fundamental book for any serious person in finance. And it came out at this time after the First World War. We'd closed the banks and everything, and then Churchill tried to go back on the pre-World War I parity of £1 is $4.84. This is complete nonsense. And that insistence on his part wrecked the economy, caused a general strike, a depression, and so on. But Keynes already wrote a book about why not to do that. So this is crucial. And then in 1930, Britain at least left the gold standard, not America. America saw its opportunity to stay linked to it. In 1944, after the just before the Second World War finished, in Bretton Woods, we created a system of worldwide currencies that linked them all together, and it was hoped in that way we could kind of manage this world economy of ours. In 1971, that crashed when President Nixon closed the gold window in the United States, disconnected the US dollar from gold. And he did that when everyone was watching, I think they were all watching Laramie. All of them were watching Laramie, 15th of August, 1971. Not all of them, but many, many Americans were watching Laramie, and he chose this moment to disconnect the dollar from gold, close the gold window. And then, in theory, at that point, all currencies float against each other. That's the background of the last 50 years. And then this last one here is 2008, which you might remember was the time of the global financial crisis. So I put these dates in because they're actual dates in financial history, and you can't fault me on that. I think they're pretty accurate. But then I want to give an interpretation of this. And I'm going to use colors because it does all the work for me, and I hope they're visible. So this is a kind of timeline. You can see this as a timeline if you want to. It's also kind of coming down to earth, you might say. You could see this as becoming more and more individuated people of the earth and not floating up in the clouds and believing in gods and believing all sorts of weird stuff. Now we know what we're doing. So you can see it as a kind of material plane, if you like. But in economics, you can describe this as a trajectory of the goods market. So if I draw a line like this is the goods market. And by that I mean it's forever stable, meaning you can't wear more than one pair of shoes at a time. If you have a second pair of shoes, that's inventory or stock on your balance sheet. The great example of that was Mrs. Marcos, who had, I think, 3,000 pairs of shoes, and she was very pleased, but she only had one pair of shoes, actually, she had 2,999 inventory of shoes. So it's a subtle point. Goods, you can only eat one loaf of bread, let's say, at a time. That's probably not going to work. Or you can't eat it and then live forever on it. There's something about goods. You can only wear one shirt at a time. You may have 150 shirts, but there's certain stability. They are just a match. The shirt I'm wearing is a match for my needs. My other shirts, I could in fact start selling them and start a whole separate economy. And this is an important feature of the modern economy. The modern financial economy is largely a shadow created out of selling the things you have that you don't actually need. So that's an important image. And it just means, in principle, the goods economy will always be a match for what people need. There may be a lack of clear distribution, but in principle, this is a very important story. The goods economy can never be unstable. And now if I plot on that the money economy, for many, many years, you had edicts coming from the gods or from the elders, where money was completely controlled by church, by codification and so on. So a good example, which the merchants contested in Europe anyway, was interest, usury, all these discussions. And they didn't want these controls on their economy. They just wanted to be left free. And the church, in the end, had to abandon all its controls. But you can make a picture of that going backwards. How many controls are run on a modern economy? If you go to a serious Islamic country, I don't mean necessarily fundamentalist, but the point of Sharia law is that none of your conduct is outside the code given by Muhammad. You cannot act immorally, you just act with, and the Sharia law is monitoring your every action. So in finance, what Sharia law does, you have a kind of transaction committee that checks it's a proper deal. You know, you're not being a cheat or something like this. And then you have a Sharia committee which checks that fits the Quran, not in fundamentalist sense, but in a very profound sense. You must not make a gain at someone else's expense. In Sharia law, this is forbidden, and it's monitored to make sure that no one makes a gain at someone else's expense. In the modern economy, that's a challenge we have, but there's no law on us to make it happen. Maybe there's a thing called equity in English law, in fact, to make sure that what you're doing is doable and also fair. But we don't have anyone monitoring our behavior, forcing us to behave equitably, as you do under Sharia law. And so there are many examples one can give where the actual conduct of the goods economy was controlled, and money could never, ever be a kind of proxy for this world. And you find even in coins, it's all just kind of excess material used as a coin. It's not yet a blip on a computer. And then you come to a point here where technically, having fought Napoleon for maybe 18 years, I think, to do that, to fund that war, we had to suspend the gold standard and pump out money. And at the end of such a war, and this was the case, you have to stop that whole process, come back on the gold standard, and not print money, because all that has to be paid for. And this is the crucial point. The way that happened, and it took about, I think, maybe 6 years to figure it out. But the way that happened, something happened where the money markets, the banking system, disconnected itself from the goods market, ever so imperceptibly, but it started to lead a life of its own. And now you can start to see it quietly, this is not the same trajectory, it quietly keeps disconnecting itself. So here I just go to when we disconnected from gold, this is the whole discussion in the First World War, and finally in 1930, the Bank of England disconnected ourselves from gold. This is a kind of emancipation. It's now, what are we going to link our economy to, if not to gold? This is always a problem, it's still the problem. And then you can see with Bretton Woods, they're trying to do the same thing. But what you can see, this emancipation suddenly goes like that. And I won't go into the detail, but with the breaking, when the United States broke its link to the gold standard, there's no anchor left in the world. The anchor is the word we use. There was no anchor left, and you can just see it went to the sky. And the image I often give for that is from being a sailor. If you're at sea, you can be very in calm waters. The worst time for me was we were in calm waters, and then there were 4 little sprinkler systems started up. And once you see a little sprinkle of water going like this, you know this is going to be not a tornado, a water spout. And you just hope, because it'll just start like this, and then suddenly it will go all the way up to the cloud, and once it hits the cloud, it moves. And you just hope it moves away from you and not towards you. So you can see in this, I use that analogy because you can see lots of wisps of things, information here, and then suddenly we lose the connection to gold completely, and there's a huge acceleration and this huge spike in 2008. And the main thing in 2008, you can see it in the detail of Northern Rock and all these banks. People thought the financial system could exist independently of the real economy. And once you think that, now you're going to have a crash. It's like when you corner a market. When you corner a market, never buy the penultimate product, because that will crash the market. So this is a very common phenomenon. That market crashed because we had this idea that we can live in this world of finance without any relationship to the real economy. And ever since then, we've had a big question. What is going on? And professionally, how soon can we get a soft landing from this mess? And that's why I say today we live in a constantly unstable situation, constantly pushing the can down the street, pumping out all sorts of money, hoping the crisis will not reappear. Thank God we had COVID, because there are people who said just prior to COVID, we're about to have another huge financial crash. So we found a nice way of pumping out all sorts of money, quite legitimately, but that's pushed the can down the street enormously. We don't have a solution for this. So that's part one. The scale is totally different, obviously, and this is part two. And I think that's a fairly accurate depiction of the financial system as it's come about and as it is today. Now, I just want to add a couple of points to this. I once gave a lecture a bit like this to a whole group of UNESCO teachers in Germany. It was their 60th anniversary. And they came and saw a drawing like this. And then one of them came up to me. He said 2 things. Firstly, do you ever wear a bulletproof vest? And I said, what? Well, that warrants a bulletproof vest, because this is not going to be liked by lots of people who think they run the world through money, because you've just shown how you can run the world through money, and we don't need them. So do you wear a bulletproof vest? He was quite serious. But his other question was much more interesting. He said, now I get it. You've given us a coat hanger. He was a history teacher. And now I can hang all sorts of coats on your coat hanger, all sorts of bits of information that I have or I can get hold of. But I never had a coat hanger, he called it, a kind of connection in which I can hang anything on it. And I have tried ever since then. You can come across any event in history, and does it hang on this coat hanger? It's quite interesting to test. So that was one thing, and it's kind of stabilizing. In fact, if you know that in this huge, complicated world, there is some truth, accessible truth, and you can rely on it. Second thing is, this timeline is going from the past to the future. I usually like to say here, be careful, because most of you, I think, are all Anglo-Saxon, so you're used to writing from left to right, and looking from left to right, probably. I don't expect many of you started at this end of the drawing. You started here, and that's very tricky if you go into countries that don't write left to right, like Islamic countries or Chinese countries, because they write up and down, often from right to left. So there's a huge supposition in this, which I feel duty-bound to point out, that in our mind we're heading in this direction, and we're going from the past to the future, and not the other way around. And as an economist and as an economic historian, this is quite fundamental. For me, there is no thought in my mind that our lives today and tomorrow are somehow created out of yesterday. My image as an economist is all we've done is we've kind of got a sense, and it looks like today's constitution or today's theory, now let's go for, oh no, we'll throw that in the bin. We found a new piece of information. So in fact, all the time we're going forward because we're reading the future as it comes towards us. For me, this is modern history. And you can then start to look backwards, and all this becomes predictable or understandable. But you can also then start to do what economists like to think they do all the time. You can predict events. And economics builds its whole reputation on its ability to predict what's happening. Until, as Her Majesty said, didn't anyone see it coming? All you economists. But I think it's an important thing to have a sense that out of this kind of finance, you start to read the future, and as a citizen, that future will be born out of what you in fact do. So after 2008, everything depends on how you manage your money, what you do, how you trade, what you buy, what you sell. The central bank has very little power over your behavior. And the other thing which is important here, if you go further back, you might say, you come into a world where we're always looking backwards, and it plays out in finance. We're always trying to preserve our capital. I don't know anyone who's not trying to preserve their capital or their balance sheet. It's just fundamental to most people's existence. But if you're going to go forward, you have to give up doing this. You have to learn to breathe with the future. You have to follow what's coming towards you and trust, in fact, the capital you need will be there when you need it. I call this inspiration or respiration, very deliberately. You have to breathe with the future that comes towards you. And if you start to breathe at it, so to speak, in order to preserve your capital, you create problems for yourself. We might want to explore that later. And so just to kind of link to the circulation, the critical thing for me in modern finance is because we are so busy preserving capital for all sorts of reasons, that is our main illness, our main problem, our main technical difficulty. And we somehow, to get onto the idea, we need to circulate the capital. And this is, I just want to touch on this briefly. Very few people have had this idea of circulating capital because they're so busy trying to amass it or preserve it from inflation or whatever else might be going on. There are people who have excess capital, meaning more capital than they need for their existence, however you define it, or however they define it. And the savvy people among those people know that if they don't pass their excess capital on, it will just diminish in front of them. So there are savvy people who also have excess capital, who then try and move it on systematically. There are many examples. Sometimes it's called modern philanthropy. Like people like Bill Gates, people who've made a huge amount of money out of nowhere, out of nothing, and they didn't know how they made it. And they have more money than they will ever know what to do with. They're the ones who start saying, well, do you need some? Belinda, not Bill. And Mrs. Bezos, not Mr. Bezos, are busy doing this as it happens. And I think this is an important thing to, in order to move from the past and really to step into the future, we have to stop preserving capital and deliberately start circulating it. And that primarily means if you have excess, you have to ask, in whose pathway can you place this money so that they can either start a business or go to school or whatever they're going to do to create future economy. And then just to conclude, most people that I know of, maybe not in this room, this is a little bit of an overload. And there's a discussion I go to in this city fairly often, and there's a sort of rule there. Christopher can only ask 3 questions. And it's because I have this in the background, or this kind of thing in the background. I never ask direct questions. I just ask questions which imply they haven't completed their thought yet. And it makes people very uncomfortable because I don't have a position. I just wonder whether modern finance is the end of the journey, or not just a staging post. Whereas most people in finance think we've come to the end of the journey, this is it. And I'm not convinced about this. I don't have a view particularly. It may be the end of the journey, but my questions tend to have a question to the speaker in them, not a direct question. So, and I think this is very important because when you get into this kind of finance, it gets very, very extensional very, very quickly. And the main concern that I have is not to take the ground out from underneath my correspondent, not to smash down capitalism or ruin this theory or whatever, but where is the next step? And in my opinion, if you don't have a sense of what that is and how to get there, it's almost irresponsible to start attacking the present system. And many people are busy knocking it about and criticizing and so on. But if you look at these 600 Piketty books and all these books like that, if you look for their analysis, that's 599 pages. And if you go to page 600 for their remedy, there's nothing there. It's very easy to critique modern finance. It's extremely difficult to say, what do we now build on if everything is not working? And I want to end in that area with a particular image. I hope you can see that from the lighting. And in central banking, in the 300th anniversary of the Bank of England, there was a big symposium to celebrate this. And the aim of the symposium was to ask what really is a modern central bank and what really is so important about the Bank of England. And they came up with this formulation. A central bank is a kind of monetary authority or organization which kind of exists what they call above the fray of self-seeking. And for bankers to say this, I think is quite remarkable. A central bank exists above the fray of self-seeking. That's not something Adam Smith might like to listen to. And I think it's really important. That's a very considered view. And by the fray of self-seeking, they mean the central bank is there above the goods market, which is monetary policy, and above the financial markets, which is exchange rate policy. I won't go into the detail. But those are the two instruments the central bank has, and it has to somehow make sure the two things speak to each other. But it can only do it because it's in this place above this fray. So it's not really a critique of self-seeking, I don't think. It's a critique of the idea that self-seeking on its own makes the world go round, because the role of the central bank, by definition, is to kind of hold the ring of all the self-seekers, to do what, in theory, they can't do on their own. So I make this image. And you could also say this is a kind of consciousness poll, because a modern central bank, it used to be the case until the 80s that it had levers, it had exchange control, and it ran the bank interest rate and all sorts of things it could do. But that became signaling. All it can do is listen to the markets and wink at them or scratch its head at 12 o'clock or do whatever the tricks are to convince the markets to behave the way you want them to do. But in the 1980s, central banks lost all their levers. There's nothing they can actually do except best guess the markets. And that becomes a really interesting event. I was going to say game. For some people, it is a game. You know, do I know what you're thinking in terms of your investment strategy? Do you take me seriously? And where does all this go? It's just expectation against expectation. It's just all up here. And so that became called signaling. All the bank can do is signal what it would like you to do. It can't make you do anything any longer. And I think this is really important because this is kind of what your consciousness can do. It can tell you not to buy this or that, or not to trade with this or that, but you might still carry on trading. You might feel that, I don't know, it's terrible to have plastic, but you still haven't got rid of plastic 2 years since, can't think of his name now. Not the filmmaker, but his brother. Help me out, someone. Yeah, 2 years since David Attenborough made his famous thing, and we're all going to get rid of plastic. Yeah. So we know what we should do, but it doesn't make us do something. So there is a kind of thought here that here we can see things that we should do. Whether we do them or not depends on what happens here. And the big distinction, a big important thing is we need to make a distinction that I've been trying to make between the world of goods and money and the world of capacities, getting educated, starting your business, achieving a goal, and the funding to make that possible. And if you separate these two things, you can then start to build a new economy out of this simple distinction. That I say at the level of serious theory, monetary policy, and so on. I won't give you all the chapter and verse. But I want to then say, so here we have a kind of overview. Here we have goods and, let's say, capacities, and they're not the same. And then, so you can see three things coming about. And it's interesting to me, at least, in economics, we've always had this idea that there are three functions of money, not just one. And one is the means of exchange, so you use money to buy and sell goods. Another is store of value. So the money you use to put yourself through school, you saved up. You put in the bank. You haven't bought food with it. You put it in the bank, and when you have enough, you go to university. This is a bit old-fashioned, I know. But first you save, and then when you save, you have some capital. That's store of value. And then up here, you have the unit of account, like a pound or a dollar, not the pound coin, but the pound sign. So if we're all English here, we see 3.50 on a cup of coffee in the old high street, and we know that's pounds. If you're French, you see euros, because you don't see anything in front of it. So a unit of account is very subtle. It's the kind of denomination of the money you're looking at. And it sits up here. So in economics, this kind of threefold structure of the modern financial system, it's been like that forever, actually. You can start to make it tractable, understandable. It's certainly the case in the global financial architecture. It's certainly the case in economic theory, but not understood quite in this way. And the last place, which I think it shows up, which is where you can really take hold of this whole big problem, is in accounting. And if you look at accounting, you will find, if you look at your accounts, you have your income and expense accounts, you have your balance sheet. So these are all the things you buy and sell. This is your inventory, the things, the money you borrowed. It has a kind of time attached to it. This is all immediate. And then up here in accounting, you have your closing entries, where at the end of the year or the end of the period, you pull all your accounts together and you see what the position is. But you've just gone out of your accounts, and now you see, oh, and then you have to make adjustments. And now you can close your accounts and declare them for tax purposes. All that you do from here, and it's like you just impregnate this with an awareness of what you did. And then you change your behavior, in fact. And you can reverse that. You can then force yourself to behave in accordance with some ideal you have. And the only way I think you could do this is through your accounts, actually. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that's made some impression. And my general point is that when you get down to modern accounting, whether you understand it or not, it's like it's a bit like the tip or the beak of a peacock. If you touch that and you work with that, you will be taken out into all this complicated story, which I've tried to illustrate here. But you don't need to know that to know now you're in charge of your finances, and the financial system is only what you make of it. You don't need to depend on central banks or anybody else's money or their theory. You just manage your own accounts healthily. So that's what I wanted to share. It's a bit over time. But I hope we have enough on the board to open up the floor. And maybe, Lewis, do you want to manage that? Or do we just... I don't want Q&A. I thought just let's hear some questions and see if there's a story in the various questions. So if you've, if you put your hand up, someone's going to come to you. Is that right? And I point you up, this gentleman here, if I can see him. Oh, yeah.
Is COVID our Laramie moment? And does it foreshadow the return of the gods and the Caesars?
I can say that is COVID what?
Our Laramie moment.
Oh,
and is it being used to foreshadow the return of the gods and the Caesars?
Okay. I'm just noting these and we'll go around. So there's a gentleman in the middle there, I think in the front.
It's a question to help me understand your diagram, because I'm very troubled by the bottom axis, because obviously the left side might represent 10,000 years and the right side just a few hundred. So it's not, you have to present it like that, otherwise it would be too difficult to see. But
Yeah.
I'm having trouble thinking, would the bottom axis be better seen not as time, but freedom, or some other measure which might be difficult to imagine? But
The bottom axis meaning,
well, instead of having time intervals,
yeah,
ability to be free, sort of.
Okay.
To, well, sense transact. I mean, imagine in ancient Egypt, people weren't free to do very much at all.
okay,
In that sense.
okay. So the time intervals is a bit misleading, or is that
and
what you're
also
saying?
it's, that would make maybe too metaphysical, having that bottom scale as a scale of freedom to
Oh, okay,
transact rather than
okay.
time, just a different way of seeing it. I mean, it's extremely useful as a way of hanging ideas on.
So is this axis here a kind of metaphor for freedom?
Maybe,
Is
yeah.
part, yeah.
Maybe, I'm just grappling with your diagram.
Okay. There's a,
Lessons can often be learned from the past to predict the way forward. But do you think with the onset and huge developments that we've seen in technology and the potential new way that the world is thinking, with the possibility of a low interest rate world, means that we have no idea in which direction we're going, for the better or for the worse?
okay. So what's the story behind worldwide low interest rates?
Well, that's the current mode of thinking, although,
Okay.
well, I say current, it may be changing as we speak.
Okay.
I personally don't think we're going to go back to the world of the 10% and the 15% interest rate on my mortgage when I first had a mortgage. I find it difficult to believe we'll go back to those days. Others may know more, I don't know. I was paying 13% I think it was.
Okay.
Difficult to imagine, but maybe we
Okay,
will.
I'll come back to that. Could we have maybe a couple of other and then see where we get to? There's a,
I was thinking, do you think that the governments will be able to control cryptocurrencies?
okay. Maybe one more question, then we see where we get to, if there is another one.
I'm just wondering, you said about the Bank of England being the sort of setting the ring of people, of capital and the rules of the game, and it no longer has that. So is there a risk that the people with all the money, Bezos and so forth, are just playing their game completely somewhere else, and the vast majority are not even in the ring?
Okay. Okay, if it's okay, I'll respond to these questions as a kind of bundle, because that tends to be what happens. And what I'd like to, it's not that I want to tell you what the answer is, but for me it's a way of checking whether this makes any sense, because if this makes any sense, each one of these could be loaded on here somewhere, and either it will make sense, or if it doesn't make sense, it means I have to change this. And this is after 30, 40 years of public presentations. And you can't see how often I've changed it when someone in the room says, by the way, your date is wrong or the fact is wrong. So this is a huge synthetic story. And I'm always on alert for when someone says, this missed a piece of information, because then I have to change the drawing. So let's see if it works. I'd just start with maybe the technicality of it first, is the low interest question. Because it's not on here, so this is going to get even worse because my scale is going to go like this. But in here, there's the maybe 1992 black Was that Black Monday? When poor old Norman Lamont had to bump up the interest rate to 15% and pointlessly, like just to trying to do something. And that was the beginning of the 90s. And then in the 2000, when we had the Y crisis? What was that called? Something's going to happen when we hit the end of the century. Yeah. Millennium bug, right? But in finance, Alan Greenspan, who was the chair of the Federal Reserve for a long time, 14 years, his main concern was, if you look at the global economy, all the interest rates are going towards zero. And the point about that is one thing that happens in the modern economy since the First World War, you could make the argument, and I would make the argument, I can draw it very quickly here. If I go back to, I had down here 1066 for kings. So if I go back to that time, you had lots of little local economies, and each king, each manor or lord had to have an army or contribute to the army. He also had a currency. They were mainly men in those days. So you had lots of little private economies. But they still had to trade, because it's one of the phenomena of trade. You always have something left over that you don't need. And if you don't swap it for something, then what you have got will just go down in value. So there's a little story about exchange. It's constantly trying to bring things together, otherwise they will crash. And when you come to more by this time, we were thinking more in terms of national economies, and each one of those is a little one. England very early on unified its economy. But the same thing happens. They have to have an army. But they also have a problem. Their trade is constantly in excess of what they need. They need things from other people. And this phenomenon is permanent. And it causes these economies to coalesce, to start talking to each other. And the crucial thing about that is, not Hobbes, the other one, David Hume, he said, the way that works is, when we have a trade imbalance, it's easy. We just move gold in the opposite direction. So this is an important little image. The way the balance between the different national economies was affected was by moving gold across the borders. This is the beginning of the gold standard, where gold becomes a universal currency, independent of your nation. And then when you come to the First World War, it was very clear what was behind that was all these national economies now, with their little ones inside them, had all completed themselves, particularly in the 19th century, but under the notion they were all empires. The British Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Russian Empire, the French Empire. It was kind of weird that they had these ideas. The Americans never called themselves an empire, but they behaved as if they were one. But there was one country which hadn't done this, and that was Germany. And under Bismarck, all the principalities of Germany were unified. But it was too late because, so to speak, Germany needed that much space, and there wasn't enough. There's an expression, but wasn't enough. There was no untaken over country in a hot climate left for Germany. That isn't the glib expression, but I'm trying to find it. So when Germany did this, it caused a catastrophe because it needed the economic space of all these other empires. That is an economic argument for the First World War. There just isn't room for all these empires to expand. The only thing they can do is coalesce into one single economy. But at that point, you don't need an army, and you can't trade unless you find someone on Mars. And this is really crucial. You don't need an army. And all this trade then becomes internalized. I won't go into the detail, but that is an epistemological fact. Once you create a single global economy out of history, the gold standard has to go out the window. We have to start partnering up consciously. And in the end, you'll have a single global financial system seen as such and not run by anybody. And that's a very fast image of what was going on in the First World War. And one of the things would happen in such an economy, who would be lending and at what interest rate? So I'm just throwing this out. The only way that Greenspan could get over this fact that all the interest rates are going to zero was to jump straight into this and give up the hegemony of the United States. If he didn't do that, we would just have the problem we have today, because what happened instead of that, we created the world financial markets, and they exist independently of everybody else, but they work on a very specific thing. Instead of having one currency, we have 184 currencies, and the foreign exchange dealers buy and sell these currencies to each other constantly. If that can't operate, the financial markets can't operate. And that is an illusion, in fact. So in the background, and Soros would tell you this, in the background of the 90s and the early 2000s, was this fact: we're living in a single world economy where all these currencies don't really exist. That's why Soros bet against the Bank of England, because he said, in that one move, I get rid of 15 currencies. It's a very important point. And so you have to start living into, would there be interest rates in a modern economy, in fact? Because if they wouldn't be, it's not a problem if they turn out not to be there. If you've got some other image that you need these interest rates to know how to bet the baht against the dollar against the franc, then you have a problem. So it depends whether you understand you're living in a single economy or you're living in a national economy, and whether you're depending on the financial currency markets to drive your speculation. Because the one thing that would disappear with interest rates at zero is the foreign currency market. So it's not really, it's a description of a situation. You also said we learn lessons from the past, but I think that's probably not true. I think we learn lessons from the future. Really trying to say, well, let's try it without interest rates and see what happens. Not let's try and make sure that we have interest rates. This would take you into a much more interesting experience.
Just the world of interest rates and exchange, dealing and trading will be replaced by something else. I don't think we don't know what it will be in the future. It will take place in a different form.
In fact, I think what will happen here, if you can't trade, as we couldn't, if you cannot trade with another planet, leave aside people who think they're going to create a planet. If you can't trade, all that gets internalized. And in fact, if you go into the detail, what was done through balance and payments between countries and using gold, it results in this separation of money and capital. Because in a normal economy that teaches like this, money and capital are identical. Money is an offset of capital, or is a derivative, or capital is a derivative of money. The distinction I'm making is separating these two. It results from a single global economy. That is what will happen. And so that's why I use this image. You just have to separate money and capital in your mind and not connect them. And then you will find yourself in this new reality. But you can't think of balance and payments anymore, because that's old, an old story. And then somehow linked to this is the cryptocurrency story. And I think the cryptocurrency story in the background is, when this happens, and you don't really have any nations, because you don't in a modern economy really, what happens to the national economies and their central banks, which are the great regulators, or they think they are? Because the phenomenon behind cryptocurrency is these operate in a world where there are no central banks. There are no national economies. There are just people buying and selling whatever they want to buy and sell, completely unto themselves. It's total anarchy. And it's unregulatable. Even if you try and regulate it, it would just pop up somewhere else. Because in this kind of economy, if you want to sell something and I want to buy it from you, that's between you and me. So in fact, the whole economy in this anarchic world is based on the prices you and I agree, and the person next to you might want to buy at a different price, but that's her problem, and there's no state prices, you know. And if you're a vegetable dealer in a market, or if you go in a souk, there's no posted prices. The price is between the seller and the vendor and the buyer, and that price is never the same in a row. So you get in a very strange world, actually, in the Moroccan souk. It's a total anarchy, but it works out. And so the main thing for me with cryptocurrency is I don't have an issue with that, as long as it's properly accounted for, meaning track your balances, because Bitcoin can go from here to there in 2 seconds, And the only issue there is if you're trying to make speculative gains out of nothing, then you can come a cropper. But you can use Bitcoin to buy and sell cups of coffee, no problem, in my mind. If you're using it as a way of stashing some money that grows overnight, you just need to know when to leave the table, because that can be wiped out in a second. So it's a huge risky strategy in my mind. And it's not, you cannot regulate it. And then maybe just to kind of bring this back to the earlier questions, because I think it's a sort of truth. This is an axis of freedom, you might call it, because there is a story behind money. The reason money was always controlled, in my understanding, was it was known once the human being can have money and it's free of any other particular thing, then a huge freedom comes about, because then I'm not slave to the barter system. I can starve myself to death just to have money, which I can now go into the markets with. And this, if you go back to Aristotle, it's the difference between use value and exchange value. Use value was always thought there's nothing wrong with a pair of shoes, because you can only wear one at a time. When you have two pairs of shoes, you have a problem, because your second pair you can use to swap for something else that you don't need. And this has always been suspicious in the history of finance, and it's always the problem with the merchants. They know the secret. Now my money is independent of everything in the universe, and now I am free to act in my own will. So it is a huge freedom story. And this part is not allowing us to be free. This part is, let's see what happens. And this part is how we're going to get out of the mess we're currently in my opinion. And with that, I would sort of come back to your question. You need to be a god to get out of this mess, right? Not believe in the God, but like on the back of the US dollar, it says, "In God we trust." You need to say something like, I trust in what I do because what I do is created by myself, out of myself. I've got to get back to that point, right? But I think it's true, because you can trust in God if you want. It's best if you trust in yourself. But really, if you're up here, you're acting as a kind of God. You're not in your self-seeking private, looking after yourself and to hell with the rest of us. You're up here where the invisible hand is supposed to make us all godlike. So I'm not just joking. I think, when you come into this world, central bankers, they call themselves enlightened princes, which you can take issue with. But what they mean is, up here, we're not in the realm of self-seeking. When we're down here, we're in that world. But up here, we have to think of the effect of the whole system and not the benefit from one or another part. So that's the kind of godlike attribute. At least that's what they told us they were doing. Like who? Yeah, well, I think it's part of the time. We are mini gods, right? So I do think this is a freedom story, and it's a kind of gods come down to earth, and let's see how God-like we can be. It's really, we've had 250 years of just look after yourself. So we shouldn't be surprised if our behavior is totally self-referencing today. But that is behind the instability, the permanent instability of our existence. And I think everyone knows, certainly in central bankers, that does not, in fact, work on its own. It works because Adam Smith's wonderful image was, there's an invisible hand which makes all your different actions social. Nice idea, right? I think it's more, we have to talk to each other for that to happen. So I think it's important this isn't an attack on self-interest, but it does locate self-interest, is sort of began here, and it's a little bit past its sell-by date. You can see that in clear financial phenomena. There's so many people who've got huge amounts of excess capital, to come to your point, and they know if they do not put this to good use outside their own balance sheet, it will just evaporate. They hope it won't in their lifetime or whatever, but the risk is it can just disappear. And so you do have this kind of, this story going on. It's immensely unstable until we start to address these kind of phenomena, what do you do with excess capital? And there are many people, it doesn't need a Bill Gates. Many people in this room may have, strictly speaking, more capital than they need for their needs, however they define them. And this will be in the markets for you, making money. But the more and more of that capital, the more and more of the capital in the world is up there making money for people, the base on which is making this money is shrinking. And that is just not possible. That's why it's all so unstable. That's my reading of it. Everyone's hoping the problem will go away, but it's best not to save any money today. And so what do people do? They try and pump up the value of their houses because there is no money in the banking system. There's no interest paid. So everyone tries to get interest by pumping up the value of their house, but that's a very dangerous game. Yeah. I think we're...
You feel you've answered all those questions?
I have the habit of going on, so I think you should intervene.
I've been invited to intervene. I'd just like to say a very big thank you for that performative lecture. And
thank you.
There's such a wealth of knowledge and experience encapsulated in this diagram that I'm sure we could come back to it very many times and still get more out of it. Just before you go, I just want to remind you of the third of the talks that Christopher has organised by Stephen Smith, and this time next week, about circulation of people and which is perhaps even certainly as much relevant to Folkestone as tonight's lecture. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Christopher, for a fantastic talk.
Okay, thanks.